leader is there in Jerusalem or in Tel Aviv, the Israelis announce more settlements. Have you noticed that? Because Secretary of State Baker and Powell and Vice President Biden, when he was there, they announced 1,600 more units. And this is called, in Arabic, flipping the bird. Hey, look over here, Mr. Biden, I got something for you. Because they don't care. We're not going to do a damn thing about it except jabber. Mr. Mubarak, Mr. Gaddafi never tore down houses and gave the land to other people who were not from Egypt or Libya. The Israelis do that with our guns and our money. And it costs us. The only thing that you could do would be to break that relationship so that people wouldn't blame us. And Israel could still do whatever it wants. But the fact that we're facilitating, we just vetoed that United Nations resolution, which is what, the 32nd time we vetoed a resolution which the Israelis didn't like, and they said, hey, you, veto that. Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Take care of it for you. And that is not in our interests, and it is not in Israel's interests. Because Israel by itself cannot live in peace and security in the Middle East unless her neighbors are living in peace and security. That's the definition of living in peace and security. Can't do it on your own. You can make an effort. There was something called the 1,000-year Reich that the Germans had, you remember? And the Japanese launched the Greater Southeast Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere, which lasted for a while until they got whooped. South Africa was going to be apartheid forever. But no, that didn't last either. The Roman Empire fell. You can't do that in that part of the world and live in peace and security. It's a contradiction in terms. It's an oxymoron. But most Americans don't know about this because they aren't told. They're not aware. They're not interested, and to top it all off, in many, many, many cases, their minds are no longer open. And the human mind, like an umbrella or a parachute, only works when it's open. Otherwise, you fall into what the psychologists call cognitive dissonance. And with no, my mind's made up. I have no more facts. You know, awful lot of people suffer from that, especially because so much of the media feeds them this. What's the French word? Crap. C-R-A-P-E. Every once in a while, even people as discouraged as I am feel that they may have made a slight contribution. I was on this was a couple of years ago, several years ago. I was in the Washington studio of a major network, and up in New York there were two anchor persons, a left-wing wacko and a right-wing nutcase. You know how they balance this on. And the right-wing nutcase happened to be a woman who lost her patience with me. And although we were a couple 100 miles apart, she did this. And with her face all contorted, she said, let's get one thing straight here, Ambassador Beck. I said, Peck. She said, whatever. So we're getting along quite nicely, you see. And she said, Iraq is going to have a constitution based on ours. They are going to have an American constitution. And I said, you're quite right. And that is why our government has told the Iraqis forcefully, repetitively, that they're only going to be allowed to have slavery for the first 7 years. And after 130 years, they must give the women a vote. I mean, it's a process, you idiot. You don't do it overnight. Here is a group of college students. In which year did Americans, for the very first time, elect senators instead of having them appointed by state legislatures? 1913, the 17th Amendment to the Constitution. You know. And we said, okay, Iraq, you got a weekend, write a Constitution. A what? You know. And Afghanistan, yeah, they're going to get right to it. All the Afghan have to do is establish a government, have it be solidly based, give the people education, have everybody educated, give them a solid economic foundation, have them get to understand what democracy is about, form parties. This could take weeks, or perhaps longer. It just isn't the way it's going to happen. And if you think you're going to stay there until they arrive at that point, You better unpack because it's going to be a long, hard struggle. Oh yeah, you can, yeah. I assume he's not talking about us out there. But this is the kind of thing you have to use as ammunition because it surrounds the core issue of Palestine. Palestine cannot be looked at in isolation because of what is going on there. I don't know that the International Solidarity Movement, is there a branch of that on this campus, you know, ISM?
Yeah.
These are volunteers who go off in Palestine. The most famous one was Rachel Corrie, who got run over by that bulldozer in Gaza, if you remember. She was there trying to keep them from knocking down the Palestinian home in Gaza. I've been to that spot. The Palestinians built a little monument to her, and the settlers came out and tore it down, and they built another one. The settlers came out and tore it down. Settlers, as you may know, there are no more settlers in Gaza. They left, having torn down all the houses that they built, leaving the people in Gaza with a multi-year supply of rubble. They're tough folks, the settlers. In Hebron, which the Israelis called Hebron, you may remember when the Jewish American doctor machine gunned the 29 praying Muslims at the Ibrahimi Mosque in Hebron, Baruch Goldstein. That's interesting. They were praying and he stepped in and killed 29, wounded another 40 before the worshippers killed him. Up on the hill looking down on Hebron is the settlement of Kiryat Arba. There's a monument to him there. People come from all over Israel and put flowers on this guy's tomb. He's a hero. Also a murderer. But the Israelis have taken over the center of Hebron. I have been there a couple of times. Expelled all the Palestinians. And the center of the city, that city is considered to be one of the oldest continuously inhabited places in the world. And the Palestinians were the ones who inhabited it. They pushed out all these people and they've surrounded it with sandbags and barbed wire and guard posts, Israeli army. And they closed the main road from the center of this city up to the settlement on the hill by welding shut all the doors and windows and bricking up the doors, and no Palestinian is allowed to go on that street. So the kids on this side who go to the elementary school down the side street had to take a 7-kilometer detour around the settlement to get to their grammar school, which is right over there. So the Christian Peacemaker team, have you ever heard of them? CPT? The Christian Peacemaker teams bought a house on that street and a bunch of stepladders. And every morning, the kids go up the stepladder to the roof of the house and then down the stepladders on the other side. And the Christian Peacekeeper team, women of a certain age from America, Canada, France, Germany, Scotland, Ireland, Sweden, escort them across the street. And every so often, teenage settlers come out of the center of the town and beat the shit out of them and get their pictures taken this way. You ever seen one of those pictures? Would it make a difference if you did? It is truly unbelievable. As you know, a Palestinian kid can be arrested for throwing a rock and imprisoned. And if you watch that sort of thing on television, here comes a group of schoolgirls in Hebron, led by their teacher, coming along, and Israeli kids come out and throw rocks at them, with the Israeli army standing right there watching. Because if you're Israeli, you can do it. Because Palestinians are, as they've been described by Israeli presidents, cockroaches. They're not human beings. It's the sort of thing that people who used to live in the south of the United States can understand. So they don't deserve any consideration. And they don't get any. But nobody in America knows about this because the media will not touch it. But some of those things are horrible to see. You get some of the International Solidarity Movement people who have been attacked by settlers with chains. Wow, 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 wow. And they're taken away all broken up and bloody. And all they're trying to do is escort children to grammar school who have to pass a settlement in the South Hebron Hills to get there. When I go there on these, I can't go anymore. I'm forbidden to enter Israel for 10 years because I entered it illegally once. But you're riding with your little political pilgrimage in a small van. People who are there to talk and explain and try to, and here's a bunch of Palestinian school children walking down the road. And if you start to slow down your van, the kids break and run into the fields because they're afraid of what you're going to do to them. Not a very cheerful subject, and I don't enjoy necessarily talking about it, but one of my purposes is to fix it so that people like yourselves who get into discussions with people with whom it's worth having a discussion can use some information that is not otherwise available to you. Google Haaretz, the Israeli newspaper, H-A-A-R-E-T-Z. Haaretz talks about all of this in the Israeli newspapers, but none of the American newspapers do. Have you ever heard of a magazine called The Washington Report? The Washington Report on Middle East Affairs. It comes out once a month, or I think 10 times a year, and it's filled with facts and stories and statements about what's going on over there. And they give free copies to the libraries, and as soon as they're put in the library, somebody comes in and takes them away and tosses them. Because they don't want those things out there with people. You can subscribe. You got to get a subscription just for your group so you can pass it from hand to hand. It's really quite interesting. And it is not filled with polemics and hatred. It's filled with facts that you don't otherwise get. Okay, well, we're getting close to the end here. What? We have alienated 1.5 billion Muslims, the world's second largest religion, plus an awful lot of other people who do not understand or accept what it is that we're doing in that part of the world. They don't hate us, they hate our policies. Our policies, in their eyes, are inexcusable, unacceptable, and are the actions of a demented, hostile force which has all kinds of power. We met with Bashar al-Assad, the president of Syria. There were, I think, 8 of us. And Bashar al-Assad is a British-educated ophthalmologist. And he said, you know, every time an American comes in here, an American official, it isn't very often, and they're never very senior. They demand, they insist, they metaphorically pound on my desk, and they demand that today, right now, I seal the border with Iraq to stop these terrorists from going in and fighting, you know, the coalition forces. He said, what I have learned to do is to frown thoughtfully for a couple of moments and say, you know, you're right. Could you have the U.S. Border Patrol come over and show me how they did it with Mexico so I could copy their success? He says the response is usually a heavy silence. Because our position is don't do what I do what I say. You know, how scary is that? How scary is that? But Assad has to go because he's not friendly to Israel. In the first Gulf War, I had a very nice contract with a network called NBC. And I happened to be in their Washington studio when the first Scuds fired from Iraq landed near Tel Aviv. You remember this? No, you don't. It was before you were born. But the Iraqis fired some Russian Scud missiles into Israel. No one was killed. 2 old people in Tel Aviv died of heart attacks, but nobody was killed. So Brokaw says to me, can you explain to our viewers why Iraq would have launched this unprovoked attack on Israel? And I said, well, you can call it a lot of things, but unprovoked isn't one of them. And he said, what do you mean? I said, 10 years ago, Tom, Israel bombed Baghdad. Now, the Americans have forgotten all about that, but I doubt very much that the Iraqis have. Because you remember those things, which is why President Bush, if you remember, you don't, apologized for using the word crusade in describing our activities in the Middle East, because in the Middle East, crusade has a very specific meaning. When these people came down from Europe and killed everybody they could lay their hands on, you know, Jewish, Muslim, or even Christians if they didn't recognize them. So the view in the Middle East of crusade is where the killing took place is much different than it is in Europe, who sent the killers. Same thing with the Civil War, so-called, because the Northerners didn't go through packing up and burying all the bodies, but the Southerners did. So they remember it. They don't forget it. It's part of their cultural history, even though the Crusades were 1,000 years ago. Since then, there have been other invasions by people coming in. And nobody likes it out there. And to hear us talking about how we're all going to be welcomed as liberators is frightening, because they're not going to accept us as liberators. We were not invited. It's not like General de Gaulle going into France at the end of World War II. Okay, questions, comments? Yes, sir, please.
Of the aid that goes to Palestine?
I didn't hear you.
Of the aid that goes to Palestine, how much of it actually gets through?
From our flotilla?
Not from the flotilla, but just from general aid coming from throughout the world?
Very little. And that's one of the things, by the way, I should mention this. The stuff that Israel is keeping from going into Gaza, most of it is donated by foreign governments or welfare groups. They give the stuff to Israel to go into Gaza, and the Israelis don't let it all go in. I mean, this is a triple, offense against everything that we say we stand for. And that's what hurts the most, as we bellow about what we stand for and then permit this to go on with our cluster bombs and our white phosphorus bombs and our tanks and our money. That's just shameful. They can do whatever they want, but don't have it be my fault in the eyes of many people. That's where I get distressed, because we get blamed for it since we are a major supporter and provide all of the stuff that they need to use to kill other folk. What they did to Gaza, what they've done twice to Lebanon, 3 times to Lebanon. You go into the Flotilla refugee camp in Beirut, which is one of the ones, if you remember, having read about the fact that when Israel invaded that first time, Ariel Sharon turned loose the Christian militias, and they went into the refugee camps and killed men, women, and children for 4 days. You go in there now, and the teachers at the UN schools, see, I'm not sure that you folks know what a refugee camp is. A refugee camp is part of Beirut. It looks the same as the rest of Beirut, except it's not part of Beirut or Lebanon, because it's run by the United Nations, UNRWA, United Nations Relief and Works Agency. They provide the jobs because those people can't work in Lebanon. They've been there for, decades, but they can't work there because they're not Lebanese. And you talk to General Ayoun, who says, look, it's so easy to understand. There are only 5 million Lebanese in 14 confessions, and they've battled and fought, as you all know. And we cannot take these 600,000 Palestinians and make them Lebanese, because that will destroy whatever fragile balance we have. They can't do that. Perfectly logical. But in the schools, in the refugee camps, which are run by the United Nations, they are not allowed to show maps of Palestine as it was before. In the schools. And guess who's responsible for that? You are. Because the Israelis don't want it. So it isn't done. There's a word that I've got to use called a lobby. Lobbies are not bad. A lobby is how a democracy works. If 200 students on campus would like to have something, they can go speak to the leadership. And we have lobbies in this country which are for the trees, save the birds, save the animals. We also have some that are less, you have industrial lobbies and chemical lobbies and corporate lobbies, all of that, that's bad. But lobbies by themselves are the basis on which democracies function. And the pro-Israel lobby is incredibly, unbelievably powerful for several reasons. One of which is that there is no viable opposition, because the opposition has been silenced. You can't really speak up about these things in public because you'll lose your job or your position and no paper will print it anyway. And that's what I have against the pro-Israel lobby, is that they have succeeded in silencing people who want to speak on the other side. On campus, off campus, anywhere, they will fix it so you can't have a meeting or a session or invite whoever you want to speak. The power is unimaginable unless you've been ground up in it. And the reason I bring this up is that in my years of working in and on this particular conundrum, people say, now it'll change because of this. When the Israelis attacked the USS Liberty, did you ever hear about that?
Yeah.
1967 war, there was an American Navy ship in the Eastern Mediterranean. It was attacked by the Israelis, who killed and wounded 207 American servicemen on this U.S. Navy ship. Twice, aircraft carrier in the Mediterranean launched airplanes to go and protect it. Both times they were called back. This is all documented in books. There's never been an investigation because Israel did it. And I have met with and worked with some of the survivors of that ship, and they are incredibly outraged and bitter, not against Israel, but against their own government for betraying them. The power of this lobby is something that is unimaginable unless you get caught in it. And I've only been brushed gently on a couple of occasions. So the efforts to offset the decades of propaganda, lies, mistruths, misinformation is going to be a long, difficult struggle. And the reason I stress this is that if you think it's going to be quick or easy, you will give up too soon. It's going to be very hard, but remember that everybody who has come to this country with a different skin color or religion or orientation has gone through this kind of thing. There's a letter written by a man named Benjamin Franklin to the Boston newspaper in 1788, in which he urged something to be done to stop the arrival of these people with this crazy religion which was going to destroy the country. He was talking about Lutherans, because there weren't any here. We had the Yellow Peril, we had the Irish, we had the Catholics, we had the Japanese in California, World War II, who were ripped out of their homes and their jobs and sent off to relocation centers, which you could call concentration camps. And now it's the turn of the Muslims and the Hispanics. Hispanics because there's so many of them, and Muslims because of all of these things that they have told the American people about you guys, most of which ain't true. I showed on a ship on this last cruise. My lecture series is called Thinking About Our World, an Effort to Provoke Thoughts, Not People. So I showed them up on the PowerPoint this photograph of 3 ballot booths, voting places. And there are 3 women standing in that with their backs to the camera, and they're in black from head to floor. And I say, okay, what's happening? They're voting. Yeah. And what country is that in? Afghan. Ireland. They're nuns. And doesn't the hijab look something like what the nuns wear? They're covering their hair. Huh. And Orthodox Jewish women cover their hair. And if they're wealthy enough, they shave the hair off and wear beautiful wigs. And you see this in New York a lot. But they're covering their hair. I mean, so where did that come from? Well, it came out of Judaism and Christianity, Catholicism. The linkages are so clear and so numerous. Okay, so I have come Sir,
I had a question.
a question.